When Americans think of the civil rights movement, images of Selma, Greensboro, and Montgomery come to mind. What most people don't know is that many of the first steps in the ongoing struggle for equality were taken in Oklahoma.
We didn't typically have to follow the lead of other movements. We were setting the pace ourselves.
For the first time in our lives, we had an opportunity to use a telephone. It didn't say colored telephones, or the water fountain said colored water fountains, or a bathroom that said colored bathrooms. We thought that that's the way it was.
African American leaders used the courts to integrate Oklahoma schools and universities. They organized children to stage nonviolent protests for the right to be served in restaurants and in stores. Years before the bloody conflicts that gripped the nation, Oklahoma's black communities began the long struggle for civil rights. Oklahoma has a complex and violent history when it comes to race. After the Civil War, former slaves came to the territory on word it would become an all-black state. President Theodore Roosevelt warned there would be no statehood if Jim Crow laws were part of the Constitution and they were left out. But the very first measure passed by the new legislature was Senate Bill number 1. Segregation was a fact of life in Oklahoma for the next 50 years.
Oklahoma had separation of races in every aspect of life. Separate waiting areas at the train depot, separate water fountains, separate bathrooms, separate education system, separate telephone booths. Every aspect of life that could be segregated, Oklahoma attempted at one point to segregate.
We had to ride in the back of the bus, go downtown and spend our money. My grandmother would take a piece of 3 and measure the size of your foot to go down and buy your shoes because you couldn't try on shoes.
All the buses were on Main Street at that time, so you'd have all these people out there on the street, and if they wanted something to eat, they'd have to go all the way back to the back door of Greens, not the front door. They weren't allowed to sit in there. If you wanted to sit and eat a meal, you could go to the back door and get it. But then what you'd have to do is sit on the ground and eat it. Just sit there and eat it.
If you were an African American and you were traveling, the famous Route 66, let's say for example, if you didn't know where you could stop to get gasoline, where you could get your car repaired, which restaurants you could eat at, where you could find a place to sleep at night, traveling was very difficult. And most places did not cater to black people. We couldn't go to the hotels and motels that whites went to before 1964. There was a book called the Green Book Vacation and Travel Guide. It was published by an African-American in New York named Victor Green. This book was priceless because it identified state by state, city by city, the hotels, the restaurants, the mechanics places, the beauty shops, the barber shops that catered to people of African descent, the black folks. So if you were planning a trip from Oklahoma City to Memphis, Tennessee, then you needed the Green Book to tell you where you could stop to get gas and those kind of things.
Moore and Norma were sunset towns. If you were an African American, you were not allowed in those towns after dark. I remember clearly one day my father got off to a late start, and so we got stopped, and it seemed like every 5 minutes somebody would stop our car, make us all get out, and search the car and harass us.
In 1914, Roscoe Dunjee began the fight against discrimination in print and in the courts.
Roscoe had one of the most powerful newspapers in America called the Black Dispatch. And that's where he articulated the issues related to civil rights movements for African Americans, not only in Oklahoma, but throughout the nation.
Roscoe Dunjee is absolutely one of my heroes. Roscoe was a civil rights leader in the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s.
I grew up listening to my mom tell stories about Thurgood Marshall and Roscoe Dunjee and Clara Luper. And Roscoe was the person who was the architect of all of these important civil rights battles. He took more cases to the Supreme Court than any other individual in Oklahoma history. And he was just a giant when it comes to civil rights.
Dunjee joined with the head of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, Thurgood Marshall, to challenge the law barring black students from entering the OU School of Law. Pastor John Sipuel in Chickasha had a son who wanted to go to law school, but when they asked him to be the first black law student at OU, he said no.
Ada Lois, his sister, who was also a Langston graduate, was sitting there. She says, "I'll do it." She says, "I'll do it." They look at her and they says, "We don't know, you're a woman." And she says, "I'll do it." And they chose her. They took this case through Oklahoma City courts, Oklahoma State courts, and then to the United States Supreme Court. Took it there twice. The first time they took it, they gave Oklahoma the option: close the law school, create a separate but equal law school, or bring her in. They chose to create a separate but equal law school, which was, at that time was known as Langston University College of Law. And they put it in the basement of the state capitol, hired 2 guys to teach. Ada Lois went and says, "This is not equal education. The way the law is taught, I cannot do it in an isolated situation like this. I refuse to go." Went back to the Supreme Court for the second time. And basically, at that point, the University of Oklahoma said, "We're done, we'll open it up." And Ada Lois Sipuel was allowed to enter the University of Oklahoma College of Law. She graduated and became a very prominent lawyer in the state of Oklahoma. Later on, she became a regent at the University of Oklahoma.
When Thurgood filed the case of my mom, Sipuel versus the state of Oklahoma, that became the foundation for Brown. You know, once he won that ruling in higher education, then he went on to go with public education, and then that's how he got to the eventually Brown versus Board of Education.
Change often starts in unexpected ways. A major battle for desegregation began in 1958 with a high school play.
It began for me in the classroom, having a teacher by the name of Clara Lupa. She was my social studies teacher, and she was a teacher that believed in bringing history to life.
She wrote the play for the students at Dunjee High School called Brother President. It was the story of Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement in Montgomery. We did the play. A man who was over the youth department of the NAACP, Herbert Wright, saw the play and invited Mom to bring the play to the NAACP convention. And when we went to New York City and had an opportunity to live like real people without all the injustices and the bigotry, oh, we felt like we were really somebody. We felt like we were just as good as anybody else. But oh, the rude awakening came. We had to come home. And when we came home, we came through the Southern Road. And all the stuff that we had been accustomed to, all the signs and the bitterness and the prejudice was available. Live and in living color.
When they came back home, Marilyn turns to her mother and says, "Mom, why is it we can't eat like this in Oklahoma? Why can't we just go into any restaurant?"
We had a meeting on a Monday night at my mom's house where a group of us was there. And I made the motion that we would just go down and sit down until they kicked us out or whatever happened. Just sit there. And that's what we did.
The first target was the lunch counter at a popular business on Main Street, Katz Drug Store.
She taught us to go in quietly, sit down, take a seat at the counter, sit there, order. If nobody asked us for an order, we just sit there. Then we would rotate so that when one person left, another person would come and take the seat.
It's interesting because they were not expecting us to show up, and you wonder how people have a mindset of what's acceptable and what isn't acceptable. But the waitresses there were, no, this is not supposed to happen. You know, you're not supposed to be here.
It was more the customers than anyone else. Every once in a while, managers would come hollering at us about, we don't belong there, you need to get up so I can see people and stuff like that. But for the most part, it would be just bypassers and watchers that would be the most abusive people.
They spilled coffee on some of us. They spilled water. Of course, they cursed us. They stepped on your toes. They could have did everything that you could think of.
She felt that children were less likely to try to retaliate or fight back. And we would be much more likely to get the sympathy of the people that were watching, specifically the people that were in the news people, the news media, and the TVs. So there was a strategy to what we did.
Gandhi, we took his philosophy and they trained us like we were actually in the military about the passive nonviolent resistance and how if someone slapped you on one cheek, you turn the other for them to slap you.
You cannot win with violence. And we were not only talking about winning the right to eat in a restaurant or to sleep in a hotel, but we were talking about winning a revolution where the white man, who certainly needed help in seeing what America was all about, would be in a position so after the sit-in movement, we could continue to progress, where if we had used some other tactics, we could not have progressed.
We sat there for 3 days. And on the third day, Katz decided to make a decision not just to open up Oklahoma City, but all the lunch counters that they owned around the Midwest.
That was in 58, August 1958, and it didn't take a long period of time for that particular change.
But for the next 6 years, it was one restaurant after another restaurant after another restaurant.
It's been fought here in Oklahoma, and we have taken more cases to the Supreme Court than any other state in the history of America.
Clara Luper was a social studies teacher at Roscoe Dunjee High School. For her, the struggle was a lifelong calling, and no matter the resistance, she never gave up.
Miss Luper was one of the most organized people I've ever been associated with, one of the smartest people I've ever been associated with, one of the most demanding people I've ever been associated with.
I think Clara was the chosen one. You have to have someone that's going to be the one to open the door, and then you've got to have someone to follow you after the door is opened, and that's what she did.
Leading a movement to fight bigotry is dangerous, and there were many threats. One night after a rally, Mrs. Luper was driving home with her children.
We were on our way home in a pickup that had some white men in it, that had the shotgun racks in the back of it, followed us. And Mom said, these people are following us. She told Calvin and I. She said, I'm not going home because I don't want to see anything happen to you. But what we're gonna do, we're gonna go around to the Posies, and they lived about 6 blocks from us. And she said, when I turn this corner, I'm gonna pull up on their grass. And I want you to run as fast as you can. And I'm gonna start honking. When I turn this corner, run and beat that door and run in there and stay in there until I get back. So she did that. They opened the door and then they slammed it. And she drove off. Mom drove off by herself. And many a day, I always think, what if we never saw her again?
Despite the danger, black leaders kept up the pressure on segregated businesses.
Every Saturday morning, we assembled at Calvary Baptist Church, 2nd and Walnut. That was orientation. That was getting us ready for making the march downtown in a quiet, not a loud way, but in a quiet way. And I was fortunate to be the song leader. So Clara Luper would say, okay, Joyce, get us ready. And we did our songs. You want your freedom? Yes. And we knew what our goal was that day.
The civil rights movement was just like a war. We would win certain battles, but just because Cat's drugstore had opened did not mean the other drugstores and restaurants in downtown Oklahoma City opened. So our next stop was our next target, and we had a listing of targets until the walls of segregation came down in Oklahoma. You have to understand, Mom was arrested 26 times, and we were arrested a bunch of times. I remember being arrested at Anna Maud's.
I recall trying to be arrested myself. And at the time, and I laugh about it now, we were picketing downtown, and I needed to go to the restroom, so we couldn't go where we were picketing, so I had to go to another building. And when I did, when I got back, everybody was gone. The paddy wagon had taken them to the jail. And I'm like, where did they go? And they told me where they ended up. I ended up at the jail, but they wouldn't arrest me because they didn't see me. I was so disappointed. I tell that story. I wanted to be arrested too, but I didn't get that experience. But others did.
Momentum began to build and gain support in the community. The protests even attracted actor Charlton Heston to march in front of the Anna Maud cafeteria.
Often places would find out that we were coming and they decide, okay, we're integrated, because they didn't want the pressure nor the news media negative press of us coming there. So in many ways, the press was a part of the strategy to help us open up all these places.
John A. Brown's department store sat on 2.5 blocks downtown.
We'd take your picture, you go in there and spend your money at John A. Brown's if you were black. Because our thing was, don't spend your money in places that don't want your business. If you're good enough to spend your money to buy their items in their stores, and they won't even allow you to sit down and drink a cup of water, there's something wrong with the program.
It was at Brown's they faced the longest, most difficult battle. The sit-in began August 22, 1958, and continued until June 23, 1961.
I really believe that one of the reasons that John A. Brown's was so hard was that John A. Brown's was a vital part of Oklahoma, period. You know, that's where the money was. And if John A. Brown's would have cracked, I think that everything would have fallen. But we were as persistent in the demonstrations as they were in their belief that they would never open.
The abuse and hate calls from the white community were more violent and disturbing. During the sit-in at Brown's, shotgun shells were left on Clara Luper's porch with a note from the Ku Klux Klan, and someone broke into her home and burned some furniture. At one point, the police met her at Brown's to warn her of a bomb threat against her home.
I think one thing really sticks out in my memory. It's the attitude that I had toward Mrs. Johnny Brown. From 1957 to 1961, I think, I tried to see Mrs. Brown and could not. Finally, I received a call from her secretary in which I was invited to see her. And during the time, I was thinking, what could I say to this woman who more or less had my future and the future of my people in her hands and who had not done anything with it? When I arrived at the store, and especially in Mrs. Brown's office, my whole attitude toward her changed. Because standing there in the office alone, I saw her as another woman who was deeply in love with her husband, because everything in the office was just like it was before he died. And when she arrived, in place of our having any harsh things to say, we ended up in each other's arms, crying. And Mrs. Brown and I became very good friends.
It's amazing how a conversation can change you. and I believe changed her heart after she met with Clara Luper.
When Jenny Brown's family cracked, there was a victory for Oklahoma City.
The sit-in movement lasted 5 years. In 1959, at the National NAACP Conference, there was a report about the success of the Oklahoma City Youth Council and how effective they were in desegregating restaurants through nonviolence.
The NAACP had giants in it. Now you got these kids that are doing something that even the grown-ups were not able to accomplish. And that was a big deal. Sitting in the room were 3 kids from South Carolina. They ended up going back to South Carolina, and in 1960, they did the lunch counter sit-in in Greensboro. And that's the one that got a lot of national coverage.
In 1963 and 64, marches in Oklahoma City and Tulsa made the civil rights movement impossible to ignore.
Ms. Goggins, why are you going to Selma next week?
I'm going to Selma because I think that brutality in Alabama is the concern of every American. I feel greatly gratified that we are able to express our concern in our area, and we will be going to see what we can do in the Selma area for that grotesque situation.
After Brown versus Board of Education, the question became how to integrate schools. In Oklahoma City, the idea was to create neighborhood boundaries.
There was a guy in my class by the name of Bobby Dow. Bobby Dow was a very smart young man. His father was Alonzo Dow, and I can't remember his mother's name, but one of them was an eye doctor and the other one was a dentist. They decided that they wanted to move into a nicer house, so they moved into Forest Park, Oklahoma. They were the first African Americans to move into that community. When they moved in there, because they moved into Forest Park, he automatically moved into the Northeast High School district. Oklahoma City School District at that time was not integrated, so what they did was they redistricted around his house to put him back in our district. Dr. Dow, Alonzo, was not at all happy with that, so he chose to sue the Oklahoma City Public School System in a court called Bobby Dow versus Oklahoma City Public Schools in 1961. That suit led to the opening of the Oklahoma City school system and the integration of that suit.
Garbage men typically worked in crews of 3 or 4. The drivers were white and the collectors were usually black. It was a job with long hours and little reward.
You know, people today take curbside pickup for granted. You just put your garbage on the curb. Well, it wasn't that way before 1968. You know, these guys were having to pack those cans from the backyards, and sometimes with dogs, you know, attempting to bite them. There was some horrendous working conditions.
From August to November of 1969, Oklahoma City's 324 sanitation workers were on strike. The workers approached Clara Luper to organize an event that became the largest protest march in state history. October 31st, 1969 became Black Friday. School teachers, students, civic and religious leaders joined the sanitation workers as they gathered just before midnight and began their march on City Hall at dawn.
And I was standing at the front of the building at the Black Dispatch office when everybody was lining up to march downtown to the police station. And I'd never seen so many people there, and they had people from all across the nation there.
Many of the students from Douglas High School and Northeast High School and Star Spencer walked out of school that day to go downtown as part of a silent protest moving downtown. Well, Oklahoma City Police Department was out with riot gear and SWAT teams and everything else, and Reverend Reed, you know, in describing it to me, says it was the most dangerous thing that he could ever have been in, because one incident could have changed, everything at that point in time.
The Baptist pastors who led the march said it was the most frightening experience of their lives. Police ordered the crowd to turn around and go back. There were tense moments, but protesters held their ground until the march ended peacefully. In the end, city leaders worked out a settlement with better working conditions, better pay, and opportunities for advancement. 50 years later, racism and inequality may not be as overt and severe as before, but there is still work to be done.
We got a long way to go, but we've come such a long way in such a very short period of time. And that's why I think that we won't recognize, you know, this country in another 50 years.
The civil rights movement has been forever, and there's always been people that have been underserved and undertreated. I think that we had a time, and I think we made some changes because, not only because of what African Americans did, but because America was unwilling to accept the things that happened the way they were happening anymore. So it's not just a black movement, it's an American movement. It really is.
Clearly, the process has yet to be perfected that makes America the democracy it promises to be for all citizens. The fight has been turned over to a new generation in the continuing struggle for civil rights.
Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me. And before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom, freedom.
For a DVD copy of this program, please send a check or money order for $22.95 to the OETA Foundation, Post Office Box 14190, Oklahoma City, Oklahoma 73113. Or to place a credit card order, call 800-879-6382 during regular business hours.